Welcome back to LutzTalk. I'm Austin Lutz. If you're new here, we're all about the real-world application of the tech that keeps the world connected, from 5G and AI to the physical infrastructure we rely on every single day. Today's guest lives in the modern internet. While most of us just expect our apps to work, he's the one building the systems that ensure they stay up, scale fast, and tell us exactly what's happening when they go sideways. Ryan Davis is a senior software engineer at New Relic, with a background that includes a degree from the University of South Carolina to one of the most respected names in observability. Ryan has spent years mastering the art of full-stack design. He's a polyglot programmer, proficient in Ruby, Python, and JavaScript, and a veteran of agile microservice architectures that power our digital lives. At New Relic, he's at the forefront of intelligent observability, helping engineers move away from firefighting and towards proactive data observability. Ryan, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll start with the elephant in the room. The University of South Carolina is your alma mater. We have talked about this several times, but talk to me a little bit about your career arc from graduating as a Gamecock to where you are today. How did you get to this point?
Sure. Well, so when I graduated South Carolina, I initially had no idea where I wanted to go, what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be an engineer.
Yeah.
Some sort. I obviously had a degree in computer science.
Yep.
So I applied for jobs in 48 states.
Okay. Legitimately?
Legitimately 48 states.
Okay.
The only two I didn't have were North Dakota and Alaska.
Those would have been great too.
Those would have been miserable.
Yeah.
So I did not, part of it was I couldn't really find jobs in those states.
What kind of computer science programs would there be, or companies in those states?
Yeah, no clue.
Yeah.
So got a few offers at the end of the day. Boeing, the NSA, and Cloverhound.
Yeah.
So that was St. Louis, the DC area, and Charlotte.
Right.
Boeing made my life pretty easy. The 737 MAX didn't take off, so they rescinded basically every job offer they'd given out. So they took themselves off the table. And the NSA wasn't going to pay me for 8 months while my top secret cleared.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, yep, cool. Well, I need money faster than 8 months from now. So that left Cloverhound.
Right. Got it.
I remember, getting the job offer on a Tuesday, and Chad hit me up and said, hey, man, you start Monday.
Yeah. Nice.
I was in Maryland. I was like, I don't have an apartment. I have nothing. So, full panic, move down, start my life in Charlotte.
No, that's
after Cloverhound, I was there for 3 years or so. I did a small stint at a tech startup called Peer Street. And then now I'm 3 years into my New Relic.
What would you say, throughout, I'm going to call this a short career, just because I've talked to several people who have had, just yesterday I spoke to a guy with a 30-year career in IT. And, when I look at kind of the career arc that you talk about, like I've known you since you graduated college and now to where you are today. Obviously the arc is impressive. And I always felt early on when I first met you that you were going to go do really cool, successful things. And, I think part of that is what we talked about yesterday with our previous guest, was that curiosity that someone has or doesn't, right? And I think that's a big differentiator between, successful people that are doing cool things like changing the world. And, I'll lump you into that because I think that
that's good for me.
I think that, observability does change the world. And, one of the things that, like I said, that that differentiates people is the curiosity. So I'm curious, what are you the most curious about, and what really keeps you going day to day in your job?
Yeah. So my current mentality, right, is especially with the kind of advent of like these really powerful like LLM models, right?
Yeah.
And as people are understanding more and more what they can do, is my mentality right now is just try it.
Yeah.
For example, a big paper came out, maybe a few months ago about, spec-driven development, right? And then spec as source, right? Absolutely crazy different than anything I'd ever done in my programming career. But things are changing so quickly. My mentality is like, you just got to go all in and try it. You try it for a week, you try it for 2 weeks, and, maybe you hate it, maybe you don't, but you learn something along the way. And part of that is just kind of like trying to keep your ear to the ground of like what new stuff is coming out. Some people do that through newsletters or just like perusing tech spaces. I like to read news articles about like these new tech projects that have come out, and I like to read academic papers.
Yeah.
But it's just trying to surround yourself with new ideas, and then more than just reading those new ideas, it's actually trying those new ideas. I feel like that's the big piece to learning them. Then you might be like, oh, I can actually apply this here. And while this might not work for every problem, it might work for this specific problem.
Yeah.
So it's all about just adding tools to your toolbox.
No, it's an interesting perspective because I mean, I think you know this, and for those listening, I've referenced this several times that we have a space together that, with other people in the industry where we kind of shoot out ideas or things that we see in news
Hmm.
articles, innovations or, what companies want to sell you next. Like,
Yeah.
from the OpenAI to Anthropic to Google to Microsoft, like everyone's got something new every day. And there always seems to be this cyclical cycle where company A will drop a feature or something, industry changing, and then company B will follow suit and drop, their feature, and then so on and so forth. I'm curious, do you feel that we're in a position now where companies are just racing to compete with themselves more so than they are with other companies?
So I would say that depends on the company for
Okay.
starters. In general, especially right now in the AI space, companies are racing for market share. Um, and in my opinion, the number one way to get market share isn't actually to have, the brightest and newest features. It's to identify what your competitors do really poorly
Mm.
and do that really well. Um,
It's like the old Apple model where
yeah, the
Apple was
old
never first to market for much of anything, but they all, the exception with the iPhone, but they
Sure.
always did it the best.
Even with the iPhone, right? It was, what did the BlackBerry do really poorly, right? What did phones at the time do really poorly? It
Yeah,
was
true.
they had this big keyboard that you needed whether you wanted to, play a game on your phone or send a full email,
Yeah.
right? And that was what those phones did poorly. So they said, we're going to do that one thing really, really well.
Hmm.
And that's how they kind of, captured market share.
Interesting.
And part of that is just like understanding what feedback you hear from the market and just like quickly integrating that,
Hmm.
because no customer is going to, change companies because you have this new feature that your current provider doesn't, because change is really expensive.
Yeah.
But if your current provider doesn't do this one thing that you really need and a competitor does, that's when you see people wanting to switch.
Gotcha. But so it's not necessarily like, today company A offers X feature. A CTO is not going to go and say, okay, we're moving our entire AWS stack
Yep.
over to Google Cloud or to Azure or whatever it may be just for this one feature.
Yep.
It's got to be a composition of iterative design and iterative features over the course of
I mean, it's got to be like, we're moving from cloud provider A to cloud provider B because cloud
Yeah.
provider A has proven that they just aren't as reliable as we need them to be, right? And
Yeah.
cloud provider B has proven that, they're, a 5.9 company as opposed to a 4.9 company.
Yeah.
And that's where you start seeing like these big, especially at the enterprise level. Small companies are a little more kind of turbulent. They're more willing to just make changes.
Yeah. Because they have less to move, right?
They have less to move, right?
Yeah.
But when you have, 5,000 engineers, right? We're not moving 5,000 engineers to an entirely new tech stack just for fun, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
one of my senior leaders at New Relic told me that there is no amount of change that we will do unless, it's a 25% difference. So that was kind of the barometer. It's like, if you're not, 25% better,
Mm.
whether that's, reliability, whether that's price, whether that's, developer experience, right? Then we're just not even gonna bother changing because it's just too expensive to change.
If only there was a product out there that existed to quantify and qualify whether or not that was worth it. It's so interesting. So when we talk about in the old days, 10 plus years ago, observability meant green. Green lights meant things were operational. Red lights meant something bad was happening. We're in a new era, I think, where, with the evolution of monitoring software and observability, we now get analytics that is well beyond just what you perceive the user experience to be. You can actually today recreate user experiences with products like LogRocket, and other ones like that, where you can recreate the user interface using JavaScript and show what the user clicked on,
Yep.
what happened after. It's not a screen recording, but it's a simulation based on what what the web server
Yep.
sees and feels. What do you think? Like, where do you see things headed in the next couple of years in terms of observability with artificial intelligence?
Yeah. So the biggest thing about observability, especially in the past, 5 years, we get these new tools, we get more data, right?
Yeah.
The biggest change I would say from 10 years ago to 5 years ago is just there was more data, right?
Hmm.
It was instead of, saying, oh, 5 users couldn't log in, right? You can actually, like, as you said, right, step through what they did and saw why they couldn't log in,
Yeah.
right? You kind of get the frustrated user pattern was, hey, this user clicked the login button 50 times,
Yeah.
restarting the submission every time because they thought it wasn't working, right? Okay. And then from, 5 years ago to now, we've kind of continued to like compound on the sheer amount of data.
Yeah.
And New Relic does a really good job at that of you can get everything, right?
Hmm.
You can get, latency, you can figure out what web page they went to, how long they spent on that web page. Inside of that web page, what transactions did they fire, right? When did they add something to their shopping cart? When they take something away from their shopping cart, right? You kind of get that full suite. But it's still all driven by a human, right?
Hmm.
Humans create dashboards so they can do stuff. I think in the, AI era is it's um users will be able to these AI agents will be able to act for you, right? And like, hey,
Like
we saw,
listeners, like on the back,
yeah,
like
like on listeners
waiting
on the
for something to
background,
happen.
right? It's, hey, at 2 a.m. last night, users started to be, you deployed this new thing and users started being unable to add stuff to their shopping cart.
Hmm.
We noticed that error, did an RCA, found out it was this deployment. We already rolled back that deployment for you. And then you wake up in the morning, you didn't get paged. All you get is a summary saying this is exactly what happened and it's all fixed.
Yeah.
I think is like the next step.
I completely agree, and we've talked about this before, in private, and then we've also talked about this too with others in the industry, and obviously that's kind of like the I don't want to say the end all be all, but it certainly is a world where I think really talented engineers like you want to live in, where you can focus on more of the architecture and like bigger picture things rather than fighting the fires that
Yeah.
inevitably come up whenever you make you like push some bad code directly to the main branch or whatever.
Because there are kind of two levels of kind of code resilience, right? One is your kind of pre-testing, right? Which is like your test suite, your CI/CD pipeline,
Hmm.
which is how do you prevent bad code from actually making it to production?
Hmm.
Which is only one kind of part of the problem.
Okay.
Because as we, continue to venture into new spaces, you're going to hit problems that you just haven't seen before. It's like, oh, I didn't realize a user could interact with it this way. I didn't know that, when you couple this with this new, AWS version, you get a gap. And then our application doesn't expect that,
Yeah.
right? And the second part is how do you kind of handle failure? You can have an application that fails every other deploy as long as you can kind of roll back seamlessly, right? If you can do a zero downtime rollback where customers don't know,
Hmm.
great. That's
Yeah.
that's fantastic.
Right.
And I think that's the part of the equation that is harder, right? Because one, you have to be able to identify that something went wrong, and then two, you need to have the tooling in place to actually automatically roll back.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's easy to figure out when problems arise, right?
Yep.
Something breaks, users report it, systems start alerting. It's like, yeah, there's a problem, but like, what do you do then once
Yep.
the problem is there? It's like, are you now triaging it with level 1, level 2, level 3, and like trying to figure out who it actually goes to? And I think to your point, I think that's where, that's where I feel like AI is headed in your observability space is the automatic recovery of all that.
Yeah.
We've talked about this in several past episodes, and I'm curious to get your take on. I opened us up with a descriptor of you as a polyglot, and I use that specifically because I wanted to talk about this around your ability to interpret and understand multiple languages in
Sure.
writing software. Do you think that understanding and being able to write the syntax of multiple languages is going to matter in this agentic era where
So
yeah.
I feel like that's a two-part question, right?
Mhm.
Understanding, absolutely. As even if, an agent wrote the code, engineers at the end of the day are still responsible for it, right? And therefore you have to be able to understand it. A great example of this is, let's say you need something to be super, super low level and super resilient. So you say, hey, go write it in C, right? Or even worse, you say, go write it in machine code. But now there's a bug and you have no idea how to fix it. If your only fix is, okay, let me re-invoke the AI agent to go fix it, then you kind of get yourself in a cycle where now you have no idea if something is actually fixed or not.
Well, just type "make no mistakes" and that'll solve the problem.
You're
I
right.
mean, I don't know if you thought about that, but
I haven't.
no, it's interesting because I mean we've covered this ad nauseum, but I think there's no world that we're gonna live in. I don't think where software developer jobs are gonna be in danger. I think you're always gonna need someone to kind of like man the horses, if you will, to kind of like figure out when something really truly bad happens.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, they're going to be, there's firefighters, and that kind of ability to debug will be important, but I think how you debug uh, will change. For example, being able to, you won't have to, read through logs anymore, right? It's an agent can go through, read the logs, summarize for you and say, hey, it happened at this time, right? Now you know the error happened at this time. You can, uh, you know, look at your telemetry and be like, okay, what was the user doing at this time, right? Like, okay, now I know the error. I know what the user was doing. I can recreate that. And if you can recreate it, you can solve it.
Yeah.
But going back to your previous point, I do think the days of, I mean, I've thought this for 4 years already, is the days of having to memorize syntax are effectively over.
Yeah.
My opinion on, why myself personally was able to just be fluent in so many languages was you just have to memorize concepts of like, oh, to solve this problem, I do this thing, right? And then it's just a trivial Google search of, okay, how do I do this thing in this language? And then it just kind of, falls into your lap for you. Instead of saying like, okay, how do I do this in Ruby, right? It's how do I do this? And then how does Ruby do this?
Well, and this is what we talked about before, is how it's much better to be good at troubleshooting than memorization, right? So it's the same concept where you may not know exactly how to write syntax in JavaScript compared to Python, compared to Ruby, but you understand the concept of what the problem is and what the code is saying. What about the concept of pair programming? I think that was a really popular method to write software years ago, and maybe it still is. I'm not in that world, but where do you see that as we take this next step?
So pair programming, I feel like, had two main benefits. One I think is going away, and the other is, I think, only going to be more important.
Interesting.
Pair programming was great because it reduced the number of mistakes that you made because you had, two brains looking at the problem instead of one, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just logic, right?
In theory, if you're using a tool like Claude, right, you're kind of pair programming every day, right? It's like, oh, we're going back and forth with this, right? The other benefit of pair programming is mentorship, right? I still fundamentally believe that is the best way to mentor someone.
Yeah.
Of like actually, sit behind their shoulder and like, we are going to solve this together, right? And I think that is the kind of lesser known thing that I hope we don't lose in the era of AI, right? Of like, let's see how you prompt this, right? But now instead of, oh, you would solve this problem by writing a function like this, right? It's like, these are the types of, prompt engineering that you can do to kind of help you get to a more deterministic answer.
No, it's interesting because I like like we've talked about before. I think the concept is not going away, but like you just mentioned, having Claude or having Codex or something kind of working with you, and I use the term working with you loosely here because it's writing a lot of that code. You're having to kind of filter out what is actually what code you actually want to commit to the repo, or whether or not you're just going to scrap all that. So I don't know. I'm not really 100% sure on if it's going to look the same, because I think we already do pair programming today. It's just not with the human. It's with, an agent. When we talk about we talk about CI/CD pipelines, what do you feel like is better, like moving fast and breaking things, or moving slow and doing nothing?
So I think it depends on the project you're on.
Okay.
If you're on a project with, let's say 100,000 customers, right? Then yeah, you have to move slow
Mhm.
because you can't, as I, spoke about earlier, the thing that makes customers leave is when their stuff doesn't work,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, makes
Um,
sense.
and once customers have an established project or product that they like the look and feel of, right? Then you kind of have to slowly iterate on that to, make something good.
Mhm.
But when you're coming up with something new, customers rarely actually know what they want. In which case you just have to put something in front of them. And they're
Yeah.
going to say, wow, this, fits all our use cases. This is great. Or more likely, they're going to be like, wow, that actually isn't what I wanted at all. Can we throw the entire thing? Can we like burn the entire thing down and start over? In which case, if you spend 6 months of engineering time creating a bulletproof product and the customer is like, wow, this just isn't quite it, right? Now you've wasted 6 months. It doesn't matter how, structurally or architecturally perfect it was, if the customer doesn't use it.
Yeah.
And so for those really greenfield things, moving fast and just breaking things, I feel like is always beneficial. But that has to come with a caveat of the customer has to be on board with that.
Yeah.
Of it's like, hey, we are moving fast right now to figure out what you want. And I think that can range from, hey, we're a startup that, works with, customers one-on-one to even an enterprise thing like, hey, we're rolling out this new product. While you're in our like alpha phase, right, or our beta phase, know that our typical reliability is not going to be there because we're trying to integrate the things that you want faster.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I see a lot of this where if it's a smaller company, they're much more willing to take risks and ship
Mm-hmm.
features quickly
Yep.
rather than like, the big Cisco's of the world or, even like the Meraki's or New Relics, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that there are components within New Relic that you can move quickly for certain customers. And then there's also probably like the core capabilities where it's like we're not going to change what people already love.
Yeah.
We're gonna iterate over time.
I would say a lot of what it comes down to, right, is when you're a small company, if a large customer asks you to like change one of your core capabilities, right, it's not really necessarily that ingrained in that many workflows and you can probably do it, right?
Mhm.
If you're a New Relic, right, and a customer says, hey, I want this feature, which, involves you changing how logs work, for example, right? It's like, that's a massive piece. And it's like, even if we wanted to do this feature and we think it's a good idea,
Mhm.
it might take a year
Yeah.
to like fully flesh out, like, how is this going to impact, 100,000 customers?
Right. So you kinda have to
Um,
weigh the pros and
so you
cons
have to
of
weigh the
whether or
pros
not
and
it works.
cons of like, if you're that small company, you're like, yeah, that's a great idea. If we have to burn something down and start over, we can.
Yeah.
Whereas at, a New Relic, a Cisco, or, an AWS sized company, it's like, that's just not possible.
Mhm.
Or I should say infeasible.
Yeah. That makes sense. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but I really wanted to kinda, dive into it deeper around what you describe as kinda like the autonomous SRE, like
Sure.
the agent that kinda sits around and waits until something happens and then actually takes action on that.
Yep.
More and more we see businesses looking for outcome observability rather than like performance metrics. I think performance metrics tell a story, but outcomes are what people are really after.
Yeah.
So my question is like, do you feel that New Relic specifically and observability platforms are providing that service to customers today where, maybe the web server performance isn't, you know, up to spec or top tier, but customers are getting through checkout, they're purchasing products and,
Hmm.
business outcomes are actually getting met. Just curious what your thoughts are there.
So the beauty of New Relic, right, is at our core, we're a data company, right?
Okay.
We just give you your data and whatever insights you want to kind of derive from your own data is entirely up to you. For example, New Relic can tell you that your response time went from 5 milliseconds to 100 milliseconds, right? But it's up to you as the reader to be like, anything less than 200 milliseconds is basically not noticeable by the user. So yeah, our
Yeah.
performance declined by 20x, but we're still a fine product. And that's one of the things that, you have to fight with. Like I personally fight with a lot with our internal teams at New Relic is like,
Mhm.
yes, your performance is worse, but
You're still getting
especially
the same outcomes,
you're
right?
still getting the same outcome, right? Of how can you focus on kind of the customer experience rather than the necessarily like bottom line metrics. And if you have alerting, for example, that's too tightly coupled to those metrics, are people just getting paged because you got extra load, but your kind of end service doesn't matter? So I think that's along like kind of intelligent alerting and kind of utilization of the product.
Yeah, you said it well, right? And I would say it just a little different. Like, does this really even matter, right?
Yeah.
So if a in the network world, if something goes from 8 milliseconds to 12 milliseconds, the chances are you'll never notice the difference, and
Yeah.
it won't impact anything. But if it goes from 10 to 1,000, that's a clear
Yeah.
performance metric. Where do you think, we talk about the like software not being logic. It's more of a utility nowadays where people are way more exposed to software.
Hmm.
Earlier on, I'd say even 10 years ago, when you mentioned the word API, an
Yeah.
acronym for, application programmable interface, it was kind of like this nebulous term that no one really knew. But now if you talk to anybody, even not in tech, they're like, oh, we heard there's an API for that to be able to transact data.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that the API has stuck around, but is now adapting in different areas where like agents are using APIs to pull in data. We touched on this a little bit too with like OpenClaw. OpenClaw is a platform that the original creator went to work at OpenAI after his project was released, and that type of automation around personal workflows, and now as we move into business workflows, I think is becoming a lot more mainstream.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot more people use, like non-tech people use workflows like that, and companies figuring out how to productize that and monetize that,
Hmm.
to say, hey, look, let us sell you a $10 a month personal assistant that will check your emails and schedule things for you. I don't know. It's just an interesting transition from the world of like the human element of
Yeah.
where everyone would hire an assistant if they needed help with their
Yeah.
scheduling. I feel like it's almost commoditized assistance, where now anybody can go and build this.
Yeah, the interesting thing that is, I think AI exposes the most is, like I was talking about this with my boss the
Okay.
other day. Um, it's with AI being able to spin up and do things so quickly. The real blocker becomes the pipeline of, quote, valuable work, of what work actually matters. For example, like you say, like, I need someone to help me with my schedule, right? Now, yeah, I can do that by myself pretty trivially through this, $10 a month bot, right? But what do I do with those 8 hours that I just got back from now not having to manage my schedule, right? Is do you actually have 8 hours of extra valuable work to fill that in? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no, in which case it's like, wow, I actually have to like look for something to go do. And that ability to look for something to go do is surprisingly non-trivial and also something that has to be learned.
No, I agree. I mean, we talk about kind of we open up with the curiosity.
Mhm.
There's certainly an element to, it's like the squirrel chasing the nut. Now
Yeah.
you've achieved, this agent that can schedule for you and freed up all this time, but what do you do with all that time that you've
Yep.
now freed up? Where do you think, and this is a hot topic, but I'll ask the question for the students that are in college today, focusing on like computer science, like you were
Yeah.
years ago. We've obviously made a ton of advancements in technology in the last 2 years. Even while students were in school,
Mhm.
they're probably getting ready to graduate here in the next few months.
Yeah.
Um, what would you say when they think about like having a strong foundation in CS and how it's going to be relevant in this next era that we're in?
Yeah, that's a good question. The important like thing one is it's no longer enough to just like memorize leak code or do this, random project, right? With especially with remote work becoming more and more available, you're not just competing against, the people in that city or the people you went to school with. You really do compete with people globally for that same job, which does make it harder.
Hmm.
So you have to find ways to stick out. I believe the best way to do that is still through personal projects. Of just do something that is, and especially with the advent of AI helping you do this, you don't even necessarily need the technical skills, right? To need the ideas.
Mm.
And ideas are something that I believe will always be inherently valuable because not everybody can have good ideas, and having good ideas makes you valuable, especially with AI now being able to do so much of this grunt work, right? It just becomes a race to who has better ideas.
Yeah.
And starting that kind of idea creation will be big, but not kind of sacrificing your actual knowledge of code base, right? Because at the end of the day, somebody has to debug your stuff, and
Like, it can't just be a bunch of slop is
it
what you're
can't just
saying.
be a bunch of slop, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to know that code base inside and out. And it's even if you're using AI to generate all of this code, right? You still have to understand it. And as we talked about earlier, right? Maybe that's you understand less about the performance of it, right? Or you understand less about the actual code that's written, but you have to definitely understand the outcomes.
Mhm.
And I touched on this earlier. That's one of the things about spec-driven development, especially with spec as source. The concept is you regenerate your entire code base every time you change the spec. Because if the difference between like using a for loop or a while loop, for example, is rather inconsequential on your code base, right? As long as the outcome is the same.
There's lots of ways to do things.
There are lots of ways to do things, and so that's the interesting thing is AI, when it regenerates, might regenerate it in a different way.
Mhm.
So if you really focus on, okay, what are my constraints of this application? What are the rules for how it has to work? And, what are the, end goals that I want? Spec-driven stuff really focuses on, constraints, outcomes, and inputs, right? It's like, what does it have to take in? What does it have to take out? And what are the rules for what it can and can't do?
No, that's an interesting take. I definitely agree with you. I think we're moving towards a world less about knowing how to write the syntax and
Yep.
more about what value is it actually providing, and are users actually getting benefit from the
Yeah.
product?
Because I mean, one of the things I used to hang my hat on, for example, even at my Cloverhound days,
Hmm.
was I could write code incredibly quickly.
Yeah,
I prided myself on being able to
a
type it
fast
up.
typer.
I
Yeah,
could type at 100 words per minute. I could type accurately. I was like, man, I can churn out code
yeah.
so fast, and that skill just doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to be like a, a cluster of NVIDIA
Yeah,
GPUs
and it's
sitting in
never
a
gonna
data
happen.
center. Yeah, it's just, it's still a good skill. I'm not, I don't want the takeaway here to be that I don't think that being a software developer is not a good skill. I just think that the ask, the
Well,
job
I think it's
changing.
a great skill. You just have to think differently, right? So in prior, 5, 10 years ago, if you were just a very talented programmer,
Mhm.
right? Like in the actual art of programming, like I can do something more efficiently with less memory, with less CPU, right? Then you had a job.
Yeah,
It was like this guy is just the best at executing problems, right? But now everybody kind of inherently takes that architecture hat of, okay, how can I design an intelligent system, right? Because
yeah.
the programming itself is just less relevant.
Th
And that being said, at the very lowest levels, I believe programming will still be incredibly important. Like when you're working directly interfacing with the hardware where, being able to shave, 2 milliseconds off your time makes a world of difference. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
going to be huge. But for 99.9% of programmers, that level of efficiency just doesn't matter, because you're just not ever going to reach the level of scale where that matters.
Mhm.
And that in itself is like an important realization to have with yourself as a programmer.
Yeah, and I've talked to several friends about this where, kind of conversely in the networking world and the collaboration world where I spend most of my time, you know, being able to use artificial intelligence to build like a design or a plan is great.
Yep.
But if you don't really truly understand what it should be and how it works the most efficiently, yes, it will work. Much like software, right? You could build some slop right now in the next 5 minutes and it would work. I guarantee it. If you
Yeah.
just told Claude to go build you a web server, little node app if you need to. But is that going to scale to where you would want it to be?
Yeah, like a great example of this is on X. There was a guy who was commenting about how all software engineers were losing their job because he just spun up this website in, an hour,
Hmm.
right? And Later, he has a couple of things. He's like, "Hey, I keep getting DDoSed, right? Or I keep getting like all these authentication attacks because he hadn't built authentication into a service."
Right.
Which is, yeah, if you don't know that you need authentication,
Yeah.
then you'd never think about it.
Right.
So that skill set is still going to be incredibly valuable of like knowing what you actually need in a service.
Yeah, it's going to be, we've touched on this a bit, but the kind of the skill divide where it's like you have the junior, the mid, the senior, the architect, like kind of the career arc.
Yeah.
I feel like we're going to see a lot more of, junior dev move to senior dev type of roles where you get somebody who spends a couple years building, understanding the architecture, and then once they get it, they move into that senior role because they now understand how applications should be built to scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
Want to move us into the rapid fire round. This is just a set of questions that I kind of run through. They're fun. I think they're fun. What's your favorite language, Ryan?
Probably Python, but Go is a close second.
Yeah? Why is that?
I think Python just has like the best library support of pretty much any language. People will, I think, rightly complain about its, execution time. It's a slower language. But for 99% of stuff, like I mentioned before, right, you don't really hit the scale where it matters. Like you're building a web server, right? Yeah, Java is going to do something in 8 milliseconds that Python does in, 50. But if you have a 400 millisecond database query, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So kind of figuring out where the actual performance matters is big too.
Most stressful condition that you've been in professionally? What would be the toughest situation you've ever found yourself in and having to resolve in the last 7-8 years?
Man, so this is actually a good one. It happened this past year.
Okay.
I was in Florida with my friends, and it is 1 hour before the ball drops on New Year's, and my phone starts exploding. Huge page going off. So it's like, well, sorry guys, guess I'm handling this. I was, the new guy on the team at the time. The new guy always gets the late night on call. And basically what the problem ended up being was, first we were in a code freeze. So we're saying like, how does anything break during a code freeze? It ended up being this really obscure problem where every quarter they would do a reset and kind of reseed and re-index their database, just automated, totally automated. And as part of the prior quarter, they had been like, hey, we were on, in a 2XL, and they went down to an XL for their database. And they're like, this is fine. Everything is good throughout the quarter because they didn't hit this big load. So then they go through a re-index and try to serve normal traffic, and everything's crashing. They're, blowing every page on it. And just kind of being able to triage through that at,
I was going to say, it must be stressful.
1:15. And it ended up, I was on call, or I got on the call at 11:15 and I got off at like 2 a.m.
Man, that is tough. And then finally, what is one tool that you use every day that you could not live without? And you can't say an IDE. So like
Google Sheets.
Google Sheets, really?
Sheets.
Wow.
I use Google Sheets every single day. A lot of the work I do is at least somewhat related to financial reporting.
Okay.
So it's great for that. But when it comes to just getting some big ticket numbers in, I think Google Sheets is still just incredible. And like, not everything has to be like a full out analysis. It's just like, just drag it in Google Sheets, do some quick equations there, and you're gonna get a better answer.
Yeah, just for the viewers listening, we are not sponsored by Google yet. Just want to put that out there. Well, Ryan, thank you so much. I'll close us out with a big thank you to you for giving us a look behind the curtain of the software that watches over the world's software. And to everyone listening, I'm Austin Lutz, and this is LutzTalk. Until next time.
Thanks for having me.